The 6th season of my podcast Rehash is out. I co-host it with my friend Hannah, and it's all about internet phenomena that get us all up in arms only to forget about them within a week. So we rehash them, as they say. This season is about internet subcultures, the stories of how they arrived, thrived, and sometimes died. We talk about everything from weebs to furries to emos. Go check it out. Back in 2017, when the Florida Project came out, people were divided about whether or not Sean Baker had stuck the landing on this film. As people watched little Mooney and her friend Jancy run away from the grasp of child services out of the Magic Castle Inn and into Disney World, reactions were mixed. Some thought it was genius. Some felt Baker had taken the easy way out by slapping on a quick fantasy sequence that was at odds with what was otherwise a grounded movie. Some thought Mooney had literally escaped and ran away, which made no sense to them. So as I sat in a totally silent theater during the final scene of Anora, Baker's latest feature film, as the titular character Annie breaks down sobbing in the middle of intercourse with her white knight Igor, a sobering contrast to an otherwise fast-paced screwball film, I knew that people would, again, be divided. And I was right. Anora is about a sex worker named Annie, a shortened version of the movie's title, who meets a 21-year-old son of a Russian oligarch named Vanya at the strip club she works at, and gets swept up in a life of opulence after Vanya hires her to be his girlfriend for a week and then marries her, only for it all to come crashing down once Vanya's family finds out about their illicit union and sends their goons to get the marriage annulled. The final scene happens after Annie discovers Vanya, who they've spent the entire night chasing down after he unceremoniously runs away, never really cared about her at all, and clearly misbehaves like this all the time. In this scene, Annie is being dropped back home to her regular life by a goon named Igor, who is the only person in the movie to show Annie any humanity, likely because he has a crush on her.
Excuse me, I have to get dressed. Can I have some privacy, please?
Before Annie gets out of the car, Igor stops her and gives her the engagement ring, which he was asked to confiscate earlier on. Annie, who has been verbally haranguing Igor ever since he physically restrained her midway through the film, begins to have sex with him, but then starts to punch him before breaking down in sobs as Igor embraces her in his arms. Anora has been commercially and critically well received. It even won the Palme d'Or, which is the highest prize at Cannes, becoming the first American film in over a decade to do so. But audiences have been quite split about the ending. Echoing the Florida Project, some had technical gripes with it and felt that it was tacked on. Others have taken moral issues with it, arguing that the scene undermines the film's message by depicting Annie as downtrodden, that sex is the only thing she knows. A lot of people have been saying that Baker was trying to shock us, just for shock's sake. Criticisms of Anora are not new to Baker's filmography. He's come under scrutiny for years for choosing again and again to depict marginalized subcultures. I've never agreed with these criticisms, and I don't agree this time around either. Frankly, the final scene is what won me over on this movie. So I want to take this opportunity to explain the Sean Baker universe, a rich, intractable, saturated world where marginalized people are allowed to be human, even when society is doing everything it can to take that away from them. For what feels like forever, sex workers in film haven't gotten the best treatment. Whether they're blue, battered, and lying in a body bag, a Mary Magdalene-style hooker with a heart of gold who often dies a saint, or robbing someone for all he's worth, sex workers have been moralized, punished, and flattened into two-dimensional stereotypes. But in the 2010s, they got a new face, one that I'd argue is just as two-dimensional as the other ones. In the movement to decriminalize sex work, it was imperative that people understood sex work as work. Because if we were to see it as another form of labor, we could chip away at the moral stigma that's followed it for centuries. And during this time, videos began to pop up online with dancers counting stacks of cash or giving tips for how to enter the industry, with people flooding into the comments asking how they can get started too. And this is when the sex worker got a whole new look in film, the girl boss. An arguably equally two-dimensional trope that goes down the somewhat capitalistic route of go girl, get that bag. And what's precipitated from these depictions is a startling lack of class consciousness, regardless of how class-conscious those movies or TV shows purport to be, obscuring the many socioeconomic reasons as to why people get into sex work and the survival side of things, in an effort to get people to see it only in a positive light. But what's put Sean Baker a cut above the rest is that he's a filmmaker who has now made 5 films about sex workers, 3 of which belong to what he's dubbed the sex work trilogy, and managed to maintain a holistic, class-conscious approach to this difficult subject. By holistic, I mean that his characters are neither sinners nor saints.
Often when you have a subculture or microcosm that has not been represented much in our media, it's done in a way that's very one-dimensional or done with, caricatures. And my whole goal is to do the opposite with that, to have fully fleshed out three-dimensional characters that audiences can connect with, see themselves in them, even though they would think, oh, I could never perhaps identify, with this group or this livelihood.
Merry Christmas Eve, bitch.
Tangerine follows 2 trans sex workers, Cindy and Alexandra, as they work the Hollywood Strip on Christmas Eve. And what's notable about Tangerine is that Baker doesn't shy away from showing us the uglier sides of Cindy and Alexandra's personalities. For the duration of the film, we watch Cindy brutally drag a woman she believes to have slept with her pimp boyfriend all over the city barefoot. At the end, we find out Alexandra slept with Cindy's boyfriend, something she's been keeping from Cindy this entire time. But Baker never places a scornful eye on them, instead asking us to extend to them a bit of grace and understanding. Spliced into the action of Tangerine are also very tender moments, particularly this ending where as Cindy storms away from Alexandra after learning about her betrayal and receives a face full of urine after being attacked by a group of transphobic men in a car, the 2 women sit quietly in a laundromat waiting for Cindy's clothes to dry, and Alexandra offers Cindy her wig. Same goes for Haley in the Florida Project. We watch Haley do some questionable, if not outright abhorrent things in this movie, refusing to punish Mooney for setting fire to an abandoned condo complex, allowing Mooney to be in the motel room while she solicits sex for money, and viciously beating her best friend Ashley right in front of Ashley's son. This caused a lot of debate among viewers as to whether Haley is a villain, but she isn't. And that's thanks to Baker's empathetic and accurate portrayal of class. Baker has cited Italian neorealism as a major inspiration for his films, and that checks out. Italian neorealism was a movement that came about in post-war Italy after the fall of Mussolini, and it placed a documentary-esque focus on working-class subjects and the difficult material conditions of their lives. You could say the same for just about any of Baker's films, and especially his films about sex work. Red Rocket is the film that most closely embodies Italian neorealism, particularly with its use of crash zooms. It's also one of Baker's most cynical films, given that its main character is a charming bottom feeder named Mikey, an ex-adult film star who exploits just about every relationship he has in order to crawl his way back into the industry. The people Mikey takes advantage of, namely his ex-wife Lexi and her mother Lil, do not exactly have much to give. Lexi and Mikey both enjoyed success in the adult film world, but Baker aptly shows how quickly that success can come crashing down due to the availability of drugs in this industry. This is something he also explores in his 2012 feature Starlet. We see how Lexi's life before the start of the film spiraled out of control and came crashing down around her, to the point that she now lives with her mother, also an addict, and is forced to solicit on Craigslist in order to pay their rent. It's a harsh reality. Little needs to be said from the women in Tangerine for us to get a sense that they're struggling. The very fact that it's Christmas Eve and they are working from day to night tells us all we need to know. Their approach to work is matter of fact, and their on-the-jobness never really stops.
Christmas Eve, we're gonna go our separate ways, because I think that's a lot easier than calling our family.
And then coming back to Haley. Haley was a teen mom. She loses her job at a strip club at the start of the film because she refuses to sleep with clients, and tries desperately to find any sort of income that'll help keep her and Mooney housed at the motel. The movie is marked by frequent scenes of Haley going into the motel office to pay rent, scenes of she and Mooney walking around the nearby hotels to sell whatever they can to survive. But as things get more precarious for Haley, she ends up having to solicit out of her room to make ends meet. When she arrives at Ashley's room before beating her, it's out of desperation, and likely loneliness too. Immediately after the attack, Haley runs back to the room and throws up in the toilet, disgusted by her own actions.
Mom, are you okay?
This is a person who has been pushed to her limits in every possible way. Like I said, this attention to working class subjects has drawn some negative attention to Baker over the years, from people who argue that his interest in these subjects is fetishistic, I've even seen people compare Anora to that atrocious Nicola Ann Peltz film Lola that came out earlier this year. But Baker himself has been very careful to avoid languishing in the suffering of others. He once said in an interview with Film Comment back in 2015 that he didn't want to make a plight of story, that he was attempting to tell universal stories that anyone could relate to, with universal themes. And I think the way he achieves this is through an element of fantasy. While it would be somewhat insulting to pin Baker's films down to a single genre, I'd say the closest thing they come to is something like realist fairy tales. For a director to enter into a subcultural community and revel in their suffering would be to diminish the universal quality of that film, because it exposes an inherent power differential between the person with the camera looking and the people being depicted. Fairy tales, however, are designed with a universal element in mind. Literary scholar Jack Zipes has this great quote about the purpose of fairy tales, where he says, "No matter what the plot may be, the tales all celebrate our capacity as readers and potential transmitters of tales to wonder. We do not want to know the ultimate resolution. We do not want to name God, gods, goddesses. We do not want to form craven images. We do not want to have utopia designated for us. We want to remain curious, startled, provoked, mystified, and uplifted. We want to glare, gaze, gawk, behold, and stare. We want to be given opportunities to change, and ultimately, we want to be told that we can become kings and queens, or lords of our own destinies. We remember wonder tales and fairy tales to keep our sense of wonderment alive, and to nurture our hope that we can seize possibilities and opportunities to transform ourselves and our worlds." Zipes says that traditional fairy tales rarely end unhappily. They're meant to end on a utopian note, the happily ever after note where the story is really just beginning and the struggle is over. But this doesn't mean that fairy tales do not have a social purpose. Sure, they offer an escape from reality, but historically, these kinds of stories, quote, could serve to stabilize, conserve, or challenge the common beliefs, laws, values, and norms of a group. So while many fairy tales can cement the status quo, others can challenge it. And Zipes explains that, especially in the early and mid-20th century, they began to serve a social function as well. In Germany especially, writers like Hermann Hesse and Thomas Mann were writing fairy tale stories that contained political and philosophical themes. Zipes also uses the example of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, an explicitly pacifistic tale that was written in response to Tolkien's experiences as a soldier in World War I. The Hobbit ends with Bilbo returning home, but the series to which it belongs, Lord of the Rings, ends with his nephew Frodo leaving home, deeply affected by his experiences on the way to destroy the ring and unable to return happily to his humble old life. It's not necessarily a happy or a utopian ending by any means. Zipes says that in the US especially, there have been significant efforts to sanitize fairy tales in order to protect kids from their less utopian elements. We can thank Disney for that. So it's easy to see why people would look at Baker's films and say, hey, that's not a fairy tale. Baker's films don't end on a happily ever after note. They often end with our characters the same, if not worse off than they were before. But that doesn't mean these films can't take on elements of the fairy tale as well, or fit the mold of the social or political fairy tale. I know Baker has said he's emulating Italian neorealism, and in many ways he is, but his films also soften the harsh realities of their subjects by allowing for moments of tenderness and humor, sometimes even fantastical moments too, which have a social leaning. Red Rocket is ultimately a dark comedy film, a cynical character study of a prolific grifter, and we're encouraged to be both impressed by his grift, but also to laugh at him, especially in the end as he runs naked across town to his teenage girlfriend's house. The movie ends, much like Baker's other films, quite abruptly, in a dream sequence where Mikey, having lost all the money he was going to use to fly he and Strawberry to LA, stands at her doorstep and imagines her in a Lolita-esque swimsuit, a bringing to life of his pathetic delusions. Roll credits. In Tangerine, Baker crafts for us an adventure buddy comedy, where sex work is a backdrop and friendship is the focus. He could easily have taken a bleak approach to the subject, but Tangerine, which was shot entirely on iPhone, is brightly saturated to reflect the hot, relentless California sun. It's a day in the life, but the antics are so absurd and could easily divulge into something much more violent, especially when all of the characters end up in a confrontation at a donut shop. But the movie opts for a gentler approach. Again, it ends on a note of friendship rather than hardship, or at least friendship in hardship. Poverty and survival are also a secondary focus of the Florida Project. That's not to say this movie is not about the horrific class disparity of Florida that's resulted in an entire transient population referred to as hidden homeless, to which Mooney and Haley belong. But the movie is an homage to The Little Rascals, a Depression-era show about the misadventures of children with the backdrop of economic hardship. Here, we follow Mooney and her friends from the neighborhood as they run amok around the eerily colorful, highway-laden area just outside of Walt Disney World. We get a glimpse inside the precarious, paycheck-to-paycheck lives of the inhabitants of the motel that Mooney and her mom live in. But by all accounts, Mooney and the other kids are having the time of their lives, eating ice cream whenever they want, pranking neighbors and tourists, and exploring abandoned buildings. Similar to Red Rocket, Florida Project ends on a note of entering the character's inner fantasy world, allowing us to escape for just a moment from Mooney's fate, one so unbefitting an innocent child. For years, Baker resisted the insinuation that his movies have elements of the fairy tale, but eventually he acquiesced to the idea that his characters are chasing a happily ever after. An interviewer from Backstage says, "In his work, the American dream of succeeding against all odds can make any setting seem ideal and picturesque." Anora shares qualities of all of Baker's films. Baker wanted to model the club that Annie works at, called Headquarters, after the intimate, transactional nature of an old dime-a-dance club, because he was interested in the psychological dynamic between client and professional. And from the first sequence, which is improvised by Mikey Madison, we see that Annie is very much a professional, code-switching with each man and gracefully guiding them towards the ATM machine. Some people were alarmed by how many sex scenes were included between Vanya and Annie, but Madison has defended them on the basis that it's important we see Annie doing her job. And I agree. The movie still holds the position that sex work is work.
Once you give me health insurance, workers' comp, and a fucking 401k, then you can tell me when I work and not work.
Baker also touches on the social stigma attached to Annie's profession, as the goons and Vanya's family frequently conflate who Annie is with what she does.
He shamed his family by marrying somebody like you.
But just because Annie is an operator does not mean she's a girl boss. And just because she's socially shamed does not mean she's downtrodden. She lives in a house with her sister, she buys nice clothes and has nice hair and nails, she seems generally pragmatic about her job, and she's not a saint either, frequently falling for the provocations of her abrasive coworker Diamond, not helping her sister around the house, and having a potty mouth like no other. Sex work scholar Lauren Kirshner argues that it's important we make the distinction of what sex workers actually want to escape from. She says, Anora wants to be lifted out of the workforce that all workers struggle to survive in, instead of being lifted out of an inherently shameful profession. And the movie very much focuses on this desire for escape, a desire shared by Baker's other characters as well, with the fairy tale angle. So many times in Anora, the film could have descended into something much more dark. In another kind of movie, or with a different kind of director, that home invasion scene with the goons could easily have resulted in Anora being seriously injured, or even dying. But instead, Baker oscillates between seriousness and screwball to preserve Anora's agency, what little she has of it. And so the focus of that scene is directed away from Anora being ditched and ambushed, and onto the patheticness of the goons, kind of like that Robin Hood sequence in Shrek. Maybe it isn't believable that she could take these guys all by herself, but critic Justin Chang argues in his review that this is an example of how the bodily control that Anora exhibits on the job seamlessly translates into self-defense situations like this one. Chang gave Anora a glowing review, and argues that this kind of generic multitasking is classic for Baker's filmography. He says, "So it is that Anora, by turning a teeming slice of life and a virtuoso farce, reveals itself in the final stretch as a cracked fairy tale." I love Sean Baker's films. I think because he does such an incredible job at striking a balance between cultural authenticity, grit, fantasy, and tenderness. Those are not easy things to master. When I think about his films, I get a warm feeling. And what an odd thing to feel about films that take marginalized, suffering people as their subjects. That's why I think he's one of the best directors working today. But it seems like this approach has come at a bit of a cost, because not everyone thinks Baker's films are humanizing. In his review of Anora, genre-jumping quality of Anora reflects something endemic to all of Baker's films, that his characters lack interiority. This is a sentiment I've seen among most detractors of Anora. Brody acknowledges that Baker is empathetic towards Anora, but that he refuses to grant her a free voice, and in turn, his work is condescending towards her. He says, "Anora is a film of cinematography, but not of images. Baker's pictures illustrate and decorate and deliver a story, but they have little identity in themselves. They're secondary, dependent, subservient. There's a significant work of art lurking within Anora, but it's confined within the limits of a potboiler. I agree with Brody that Anora's weakest element is these potboiler scenes, which stretch over the entirety of the second act and comprise mostly of actors improvising their lines and delivering an endless string of expletives.
In house, they f***ing tied me, they attacked me. That motherfucker was making me sit on his f***ing lap. You guys are f***ing crazy.
Mikey Madison said that this was her intention during these parts because she didn't want Anora to stop talking, but it can get pretty tiresome.
Shut the f*** up!
And this is a weakness in many of Baker's films. Sometimes he doesn't know when to trim the fat.
No!
But to Brody's point that because of these potboiler scenes, Baker somehow robs his characters of their emotional interior lives, I'd argue that a character does not have to be monologuing their feelings at us for us to understand their hopes and desires and fears. While Baker's films are not full-blown realism, they are authentic. He does street casting, he nails colloquialisms, but what also makes his films authentic is that they're action-packed. When you're struggling, your ambition is often, unfortunately, pretty simple. To not struggle anymore, to survive. My family has gone through periods of financial difficulty, and when I was a kid, sometimes I would say something to my dad and he wouldn't hear me. He'd just be staring off into space. I'd try to get his attention again, and he'd jump, getting pissed at me for interrupting his train of thought. When I'd cry and ask him why he snapped, he'd explain that he's currently trying to figure out how to put dinner on the table. In fact, he said he was constantly thinking of that, every single second of the day. And that's always stuck with me. In a world of precariousness and economic hardship, time waits for no one, because time is money. So Baker's characters are not afforded a moment of rest or reflection. They are always on the move. Cindy can't even have a second to recuperate from discovering Alexandra's betrayal before heading straight back to work. Haley is set on a never-ending track of going back to the drawing board, conjuring new ways to make money by any means necessary. Even Mikey in Red Rocket, who we aren't asked to empathize with, is in a perpetual state of hustling. Of course, these characters may have begun their lives with grander dreams, but those dreams have been slowly whittled down by circumstance and class oppression. So we learn about who these characters are not through down moments, but by the way they react to things in the up moments. Cindy getting quiet when Dinah tells her she's delusional for thinking her pimp is a faithful partner. Haley being amazed at how luxurious her neighbor's motel room is. My favorite instance of this is when I realized watching Red Rocket that we aren't supposed to root for Mikey. It's a scene where he witnesses his friend Lonnie getting thrown in a fountain by a bunch of men who accuse him of stolen valor. Mikey leaves the scene and waits for Lonnie by a car, and for some reason at this point I expected him to either pretend he didn't see it out of grace for Lonnie, or to offer some form of comfort. Instead, Mikey chastises him for threatening Mikey's reputation. This selfishness continues for the rest of the film. But Mikey doesn't think he's a selfish bottom feeder, so why would he tell us so? We can glean that for ourselves. We see this in Anora as well. Throughout the film, Annie is non-stop strategizing about how to ascend her ranks, obtain some security, and most importantly, preserve her dignity. All things that she's, by way of class and circumstance, barred from accessing. We know Annie doesn't have a lot of agency. While the strip club is a simulation of a world where women have control over men, on the outside, where class exists, women, and especially poor women, have no control at all.
Your life and lives of your family and friends, everything will be destroyed.
This is most clear in that final blow from Vanya, where he says,
"Thank you for making my last trip to America so fun."
His choice of words here widens a gulf between he and Anora as big as the Atlantic Ocean he's about to fly over. For Vanya, the world is a playground and people are his playthings, but Anora is limited by station. This was never just fun for her. So Annie seeks control wherever she can. I think her choice to wear a fur coat when they embark on the manhunt is the best example of this. It's a visual attempt to prove to others that she belongs in this world they're so desperately trying to eject her from, like she's vermin. So even Madison's choice to have Anora yapping for most of the film, however repetitive it is, makes sense. Anora is loudmouth and unashamed of who she is, and thus refuses to be silenced, especially in a room full of men. Detractors have said that we never get to know Annie, that this movie is barely about her. But of course it is. If it was about Vanya, it would be an Entourage or Hangover-style romp where Annie would be reduced to a footnote joke. Guys, Vanya got married to a stripper in Vegas. Anora is a very different movie. This couldn't be more obvious than in my favorite shot where Annie and Vanya are lying in his bed, and then Vanya sits up out of frame to propose to Annie. The camera holds on her, changing from a 2-shot to a 1-shot, and in doing so, shifts the perspective and tone of the movie from the rom-com it's set up to be to something else altogether. For the remainder of the shot, we watch a carousel of emotions wheel across Annie's face. Fear, excitement, skepticism, joy. What this shot tells us is that this movie is not about star-crossed lovers. It's about a woman who has everything to lose. Even I caught myself wanting Annie to end up with Igor. Maybe I've read too many YA novels, or maybe it's because I thought Igor was sexy. But generally, it's because I've probably watched too many Disney movies. I was caught up in the fairy tale and I didn't want it to end. In Chang's review, he refers to Annie as a strip club Cinderella who gets a froggy prince in Vanya and a white knight in Igor. And he calls the final exchange between she and Igor a moment of rare and complicated grace, a connection that goes beyond mere transaction. You want it to last forever, you know that it won't. For both Annie and Igor, it's back to the grind. Baker's characters don't stop moving, but sometimes he allows them a single moment to stand still.
And just her line of work and what she does, she has to have a hard outer shell that doesn't really show what's happening until it really does just come out.
Annie doesn't cry throughout this film. There are moments where she needs to take a breath or seems like she's on the verge. But even when Vanya is cruelly discarding her, she manages to hold it together. It's not until the final, controversial car scene that she breaks down. Of course, this is the culmination of a sleepless night and heartbreak over what has transpired, but also it comes from the fact that she's finally alone with someone who's her equal. Like I said, Igor is the only person to show Annie any modicum of compassion throughout this journey, and is also a fellow class interloper. So his presence is one that she doesn't have to put on airs or perform for, and so she's able to let her guards down. This was the moment of interiority people had been wanting, but it made them angry. Because in reverse of the Florida Project or Red Rocket, which end in fantasy, Anora ends the fantasy with a cold dose of reality.
Yeah, I wasn't going to do that again. No, I wanted to keep it grounded. That was very important for me. I guess with this film, because I was sort of taking us on hopefully taking the audience on a roller coaster ride through different tones and genres, I knew that I had to bring them back to a place of grounded reality, to a sobering moment, to really sit there and to see, to feel the reality of the situation and what Annie is really living with.
Thank you. Hey.
A scene from the Florida Project that always puts a lump in my throat is when a woman at the laundromat gives Haley a hug, and Haley just stares stoically ahead, completely unmoved. Haley is in a more precarious situation than Annie. She's hardened at a young age, and so we almost never see her cry. For the most part, like Annie, she's erupting in violent outbursts. My favorite writer and cultural critic, Sarah Marshall, references the Florida Project in a piece she wrote about Disney for the Baffler. And in it, she remarks on the fact that trauma and violence live inside Haley, because she's never had the privilege of finding safety through submission or passivity. Violence is something that she has had to learn in order to survive. And then Marshall says something that broke me when I read it. I loved Haley when I watched the Florida Project the way I loved the Disney princesses of my girlhood. Watching Sean Baker's film, we can see both the world that has filled Haley with a tide of sudden rages and flights, and also her ability, more astounding than any of the corporate magic of the world just beyond hers, to never unleash this rage or terror on her child, and to make their dangerous world feel like a harmless game. Haley is, to the best of her ability, a good mom, doing what she can with what she's got. And if you're able to look past the instinct to judge her, you'll see that her ability to find grace for her child, in spite of it all, does make her something of a fairy tale princess. That's what Baker's fairy tales are challenging of our common beliefs. The idea that a sex worker can be shrewd and hardened, but if we're willing to challenge our own perceptions and look hard enough, we'll see in them a delicate, complicated inner core. Annie is tough as nails, but if you look hard enough, you'll find that she's also very naive. Typically, she's good at asserting her boundaries, But you see that she constantly lapses them for Vanya, like taking her panties off during the lap dance, or allowing him to sleep with her a second time in the hour he paid for, or ditching work for a week to be his for-hire girlfriend. And so, in spite of the fact that people have argued Annie never really liked Vanya, that this was a performance, she does. This is captured in these boundary-breaking moments, and also in stolen glances, which are done privately. And because she's swept up in the fog of infatuation, both for Vanya, who she liked before she knew he was rich, and his lifestyle, she's willing to believe promises she would otherwise probably scoff at. Vanya reveals himself pretty early to us with his goofy, childish demeanor. We know this isn't a serious person, but Annie can't see it. She's naive enough to believe the mansion is hers to kick people out of simply because she married him. And even after Vanya runs away and leaves her with the goons, she still believes he wants to be with her. The reason I connected with Anora is because, with a life so wildly different from Annie's, I've felt all those same emotions. The fog of infatuation, ignoring boundaries, being humiliated by false promises, the impotence of desire unrealized. And so I don't think Baker is punishing Annie in that final scene, or trying to say that sex is all she knows like they do with Jenny in Forrest Gump and so many other tortured female characters like her. What Baker is doing is pulling the wool from our eyes and showing us what Annie really is, a human being. Annie may be simultaneously attracted to Igor, disgusted by him, and want to repay him. And Baker showcases all of this in her subsequent punching and crying. It's the buildup of all the emotion she's been suppressing for the entire film because her trade forces her to. Annie is not a job. She's a person. A 23-year-old girl at that. In that Baffler essay, Marshall calls back to Disney's Cinderella and argues that it taught generations of girls that a dream is a wish your heart makes when you're fast asleep. Anything more active than dreaming, says Marshall, even wishing for something when you're awake and conscious enough to witness the strength of your own desires, disqualifies you from getting what you want. It makes you greedy. It makes you bad. I think this ingrained idea is kind of what's guiding people's speculations that Annie never really liked either Vanya or Igor. While it's a well-intentioned thought, it perpetuates this idea that Annie's wanting of a better life stems only from opportunism and not from anything else. Class oppression, the hamster wheel of survival, is what voids us of our humanity, doesn't allow us to stop or think or feel. Annie's humanity lies not in her dreams for money or security, but in the dreams for love and companionship that go along with that. Zipes defines fairy tale protagonists as being naive, characters who are able to succeed because they have retained their belief in the miraculous condition of nature, revere nature in all its aspects. That shot on the bed, where Annie goes from scoffing at the proposal to fully embracing it, is what makes her a Cinderella. She's shrewd, but within that hardness is a very human person who is willing to do the most difficult thing of all. Actively, loudly, and fully awake, she deigns to dream. Sean Baker blends fantasy and realism to avoid looking at his subjects in a provocative light. But what about a filmmaker like Todd Solondz, who does the opposite, who takes the most verboten subject matter imaginable and somehow makes it funny? My series, Taboo on Screen, is about filmmakers like Solondz, who are interested in the most extreme limits of human behavior, exploring the ugly, morally gray, and taboo aspects of humanity, and in doing so, attempt to crack open our worldviews, successfully or not. You can find Taboo on Screen exclusively on Nebula. Nebula is a streaming service that's creator-founded and creator-led, which means we get a ton of creative control over the videos we make. Right now, you can watch Taboo on Screen, as well as all my past videos, ad-free on Nebula, and you can even watch Nebula videos offline with their app. In Taboo on Screen, we look at films that challenge and sometimes offend our sensibilities, covering pretty difficult topics like whether we should get rid of sex scenes, the films of Solondz, Brooke Shields and the controversy around Pretty Baby, and the wacky world of John Waters. Taboo on Screen is just one of a whole host of prestige, original series on Nebula that are made by some of your favorite creators. We're taking the art of video making to a whole other level and producing a wide range of thoughtful content. You can think of Nebula like Netflix for people who love cultural commentary, and an impossibly wide range of other fascinating subjects as well. If you like my videos and you like Taboo on Screen, then you'll definitely love Unrated, a Nebula original series by Maggie Mae Fish, where she dives into the history of sex and sexuality on the big screen. You can also find Be Kind Rewind on Nebula and many of my other favorite creators like Thomas Flight and Not Just Bikes. If you're interested in watching some really amazing original content, you can sign up using the link below and you can support me directly and get Nebula for a 40% off annual plans. Then there's lifetime memberships, which cost $300 and last you forever. And with the holiday season coming up, you might want to share everything Nebula has to offer with your friends and family. So Nebula is now offering annual gift cards. Use the link gift.nebula.tv/creator_code to give a year of Nebula to a friend for just $36. Go do it, you won't regret it. So go to nebula.tv/broedeschanel or click the link in the description for 40% off right now. Special thank you to Syed Hassan, Malpertui, Morgan, Cooper Stimson, Nadia C., Nick, Jenny Eller, J. Frost McFinnigan, Gabriel M., The Wiz Daniel, Edward Yu, Andrew Nguyen, Connor O'Keefe, Gavin Borden, Sharma, Daniel Sardunas, Jenya, Ryan Blythe, Maya Kamaeva, Naomi Nakagawa, Scott Barnett, Julia Campana, Mr. Allen, Luis Eduardo Taroba, Alexis, Nafis Bullock, Carrie Gavin, RSS, Fridtjof Holstrom, Alex Short, and Kelly Wolf for supporting this channel.